Welcome to Still Please, Galaxy here as we're back with a talk video to address the Grand Arena fleet changes. I'm going to give my overall thoughts on these changes, the impacts that I think it's going to be having for players, my strategy for defense and offense, how I'm breaking this down, and then how to prepare gear on which characters, relics on which characters, how to get these multiple fleets ready for prime time. This was a surprise for me. Over on the Discord, I've been having conversations about this. Weeks ago, Lysol over there was predicting this was going to happen, and I wasn't convinced. I thought we needed to see more ship content before that occurred. It's been broken down by others. Yes, of course, there aren't enough ships right now, but I don't think we're that far off, and I don't have a problem with it. I'd rather we get a change like this too early than too late. We've seen what it looks like when it happens too late before. A year ago, before the Grand Arena defense changes, those came too late. We saw it in territory wars with the number of teams needed on defense. Those kinds of changes happened way too late. And this, when things are done too early, it gives players who are prepared opportunities to get an edge on their opponents. There are things that we can exploit and how quickly we can get these alternate fleets prepared. There will always be progress mechanics in a game like this. Anticipating and preparing for them is how to get an edge on your opponents who are distracted by the current metas or who are lesser prepared. So part of what is going on here is the middle tier fleets all just got way better. We've had back-to-back Galactic chase events where the Raddus and Finalizers both just got tanks that were very much needed. The Empire fleet is about to get way better, where during next month, the TIE Interceptor is going to be at 7 stars for a ton of players, and the Inquisitors are important enough where the Interceptor is going to have a pilot that is going to be a threat. So what we're seeing is the Executor is now getting counters that didn't exist before. That is happening at the same time where a lot of the player base is either getting the Executor or is getting a 7-star Executor. We were in need of this change. It was going to get very stale, and stale fleet metas are boring. Before the Executor was added to the game, we already felt that with the Negotiator and Malevolence. The Executor came way too late as a ship. So the impact of the added fleet defense keeps Grand Arena from getting stale. It's also a really nice gift to players who got Rey and SLKR, because those are older Galactic legends that don't really hold up to the more recent ones. It's a nice trade-off where those players now have strong fleets to offset them having weaker overall Galactic legends, at least in Grand Arena purposes. I'm still not going after SLKR and Rey. I may never do it, but I still am going to look at making these fleets better with some key gear on characters. I'm going to break that down a little later. First, we're going to break down how I'm thinking of spreading out my defensive and offensive fleets. There's 3 main ways that we can approach this. Not exactly with these teams, but the ideas. So the strong defense, Negotiator, Executor, and Malevolence, or something else. The main idea there being that you concede that you're probably not going to clear your opponent, but they're probably not going to clear you. There are some issues with that where then it's a question of how many fleets are cleared. Do you only clear 1 and your opponent clears 2? In that scenario, maybe neither of you are getting a full clear, but you're still risking that your opponent can clear more teams than you can if you don't have as much depth on offense, because you're looking at an offense of Home 1, Chimaera, Finalizer, and Raddus at best in that kind of scenario. Converse of that is, of course, the weak defense, where you're using some variation of Home 1, Chimaera, Finalizer. You can swap some of those out to make sure that you keep the Malevolence, Negotiator, and Executor to clear your opponent. That will be enough to clear a strong defense, but the problem is that the weak offense left over from your opponent could potentially clear your defense, depending on how strong it is. Home 1, Chimaera, Finalizer, or Raddus can clear a weak defense. So I don't think that's the way to go either. But there's a middle strength tier that I'm going to be approaching this with. If I keep the Executor and Malevolence for offense, I'm going to be able to clear the Executor and Negotiator. The way I'm approaching this is with a middle strength defense. I want to keep a strong enough offense that I can clear anybody who sets a strong defense, but retains enough of a defense that a weak offense is not going to be able to clear me. With the Negotiator, that's a strong enough of a defensive fleet that Home 1, Chimaera, Finalizer, Raddus, that kind of offense is going to need to take multiple attempts at it if it clears it at all. Home 1 is still strong enough on defense that is going to create a lot of problems for anyone, especially if you gear key characters. And Finalizer, I really like as a defensive fleet if you make it fast enough. Silencer is going to come out early enough where if your opponent doesn't have enough gear on their characters, the Finalizer causes a lot of problems on defense against those weaker offensive fleets. Because ultimately what we're trying to do here is be more efficient than your opponent. Regardless of whether or not you're able to clear the territory, you're going to try and do whatever you can do in fewer attempts than your opponent does whatever they can do. Even if you and your opponent both set down a strong defense, Executor, Negotiator, Malevolence, Home 1 Chimaera Finalizer is going to be enough to clear 2 out of 3. So if you do not have the fleet depth to match your opponent, you will not be more efficient than them. So if you can't be more efficient than your opponent, you need to use a different strategy. Otherwise, you are just going to fall into a loss. We'll transition to gear and ships in a moment, but this is a reminder to why you should always finish your farms. I find a lot of players ignore farms in favor of gearing up a bunch of characters. You can't anticipate where the game is going all the time, or at least when changes are going to be happening. If you are finishing those farms, you are at least being prepared in that one aspect where you don't need to be playing catch up. And if you hoard some resources, you can quickly pivot whenever these changes happen. Or you can prepare like I do, where I take every character I can up to that gear 11 threshold, where I can then have the flexibility to be nimble enough to add key gear 12 or relics relatively quickly and cheaply from that standpoint, to allow me to take advantage of these changes before my opponents can take advantage of these changes. And to get ourselves prepared for this added fleet depth and Kyber, we're going to be touching upon each of these fleets and which pilots and ships should be getting attention. So the Empire fleet, TIE Interceptor obviously is going to be one of the most important ships moving forward. It's going to make things like countering the Executor possible. So Second Sister needs to be getting some gear. Emperor Shuttle makes the entire fleet more survivable, along with the TIE Bomber. Royal Guard is a character I'm probably going to be adding the relic to. I already use him, and being a Sith Eternal Emperor requirement makes it a lot easier. TIE Fighter you're already going to have from the Executor, so it's nice to have that one. It's a ship from its dodges, drives, turn meter, which is why it's part of the Executor counter right now for the Malevolence. Gauntlet gets way underrated. It is a great ship. You don't need gear 11 on the pilots. Really, gear 8 is enough. TIE Reaper, well, the Gauntlet, what it does is when it reinforces, it's going to dispel and drive turn meter with its middle ability. TIE Reaper is another ship that can drive turn meter to the capital ship, and it does that. As any ship dies off, it is adding turn meter to the Empire leader. The other things to be looking at is we have a number of Sith ships here. We probably are going to be seeing that long rumored Nihilus capital ship. Maybe not in the next few months, but probably within the year. In general, all of these capital ships should probably have relic pilots, especially when you have pilotless ships like the TIE Bomber. So Thrawn, I'm just finisher away. I'll probably be adding that finisher onto Thrawn to make sure this fleet can be as dangerous as I can make it. The Finalizer is a great option on offense or defense. On offense, it's a solid counter to a number of ships, TIE Echelon, adding the Executor to it. But on defense, it is super fast. And if your opponent doesn't have the same depth on their fleets and in their pilots, they are going to struggle up against the Finalizer. You can watch my Grand Arena 25.4.3, which will be out soon, where I bring my pretty good Rebel fleet up against an SLKR Finalizer fleet. And it is pretty scary because of how fast the TIE Silencer is. And that is why the Silencer is going to get a Relic crew. It is going to make this entire fleet more of a problem. That is the key relic here. Hux is going to at least get Gear 12 and then relics at some point. And then First Order Officer is going to get attention. I'm going to ignore the TIE Fighter pilots for as long as I can. I don't think they're going to be necessary to begin with. And the other pilots on the command shuttle of the First Order Stormtrooper and Captain Phasma, those are relics that I'm probably going to ignore for as long as I think is possible. But I might consider Gear 12 on a couple of them. Like the First Order Stormtrooper, that is a safe Gear 12. But crew, First Order Officer, they're going to need the relics. Crew to be as fast as possible. TIE Echelon because it's a tank. Hux, I'll start at Gear 12, see how that feels, and from there, I'll probably be done with this fleet for at least the near term. Bounty Hunters are the current meta, so I'm not going to talk too much about this fleet, but if you, like me, have a 6-star Executor, which is how I kind of approach things, because metas change. I don't like to overgear things. I don't want to spend a bunch of crystals on something that is only going to be temporary. You can't get resources back, but you can delay putting them on. 6-star Executor, in order to make it more successful, don't overgear your Beskar Mando. You want their Beskar Mando to go first. And Ebon Hawk is a great reinforcement. I usually use it as my first reinforcement. Maybe I'll make a lowest viable teams video in the future. Let me know if that's something that interests you, or I'll be using it in Grand Arena moving forward so you can see me use that counter in the Grand Arena videos. A lot of players have been speculating on Dengar's punishing one. I think maybe not now, but I do think it is a ship that makes sense. The other thing to think about is Mandalorian Season 2, we got a starfighter, and that's probably going to come into the game at some point, and it's probably going to have a bounty hunter tag. So these are the things to anticipate long term and allow yourself to prepare for, either by hoarding or by farming things. With the Negotiator, the fleet that I use is Anakin, Rex, and the Y-Wing as my starters, and I use reinforcements of Plo, Fives, and Ahsoka. I leave Clone Sergeant off because he's a priority reinforcement. If he's there, he's more likely than not to be your first reinforcement and make the whole fleet easier to beat. Jedi Consular you could throw in there to be deep, but right now I'm going to try and have as many fleets without full reinforcements as possible, because in a scenario where if things go really poorly, you could technically bring in a fleet of like Jedi Consular and some other nonsense, throw them with Mace or with Tarkin as a potential 8th fleet for the cleanup. It's hopefully won't happen. Hopefully things won't go that way, but it's something to keep in mind. If you hold a couple ships back, you'll have a little bit of extra depth where you might be able to clean up somebody. It is now going to be more important than ever to have a good Rebel fleet, which means you need to get yourselves a Biston's U-Wing if you don't have it yet, which is tough because both Biston and Scarif Rebel Pathfinder are among the hardest to gear characters who require a ridiculous amount of Carbantes. Gear 12 is a starting point, but it's really not enough. I'm going to be putting relics onto my Biston before this next Grand Arena season starts. Hopefully that'll be enough. Maybe I'll have to do Scarif Rebel Pathfinder as well. And as we go through this, you see the number of pilots I have ready. Cassian is a character I took up to Gear 12 pretty recently, and I've been adding gear on my K2SO and on my Jin, is getting all of these ships a little bit more ready. That project is going to be moving along. Phantom and Ghost are actually two ships I don't put on as reinforcements. I use starting Han, Biston, and either Biggs or the Y-Wing, depending on what I'm going up against. And then reinforcements, either Biggs or the Y-Wing, again, depending on what I'm countering. And then Wedge and Cassian. Ghost and Phantom can leave off, which is good because those pilots are awful to gear. And if we can avoid it, that would be good. One thing I've been speculating on for a long time is that we see Raddus into Profundity added. Partly because one of the things I've been highlighting is the home one doesn't do much to contribute to this fleet being good. It is 90% the Millennium Falcon and its mechanics that drive how strong this fleet is. So there is a possibility that a proper capital ship will elevate this entire fleet. That's one option. The other option is we finally see Luke's X-Wing. And the thing is, I think this could happen this coming April because of the monthly calendar we've already seen. Akbar is the monthly login character. It's not always a sign, but it very often has been a sign of what is to come during the month. It might mean Luke's X-Wing and the Rebel fleet. It might mean Admiral Raddus and eventually the Profundity. It might mean just another Rebel ship of some sort. And now because of the Omicron on Akbar, it is more worthwhile than it ever was to add some resources to your Akbar and actually make him a little bit more useful, which is something I would not have done pre-Omicron. The Resistance fleet. It's going to frustrate a lot of you players who don't want to put any resources on Rose. Time to put those resources on Rose, and you can see how I've been preparing my roster for a long time. I have Gear 11 on all these pilots. With that Omicron, Rose has some interesting mechanics that are worth considering, but at least relics on one of these pilots is going to likely be necessary, and Gear 12 at a minimum. Those are things that I'm going to be adding. I also want to add some resources to raise Millennium Falcon, which is tough because I don't really want to add any additional gear to these characters, but right now it gets knocked out a lot when I'm trying to counter using this thing. I want to make this as strong as possible. Probably going to be starting with Finn, because Finn is at least much more dangerous and useful than Scavenger Ray is as a character. Poe is the next one that is deserving of resources, but I'm going to try and avoid it because he's not a character that I use. That's the same deal with the Resistance pilot. Holdo is going to deserve some resources. Any capital ship leader, again, is going to need to be at least under consideration for relics. I'll be taking her up to Gear 12. What I've been finding with this ship is I get really close to being able to use the ultimate. So any edge I can get to add a little bit of survivability might be enough to be able to use that ability. The Separatist fleet is great. One of the nice things here is you can get away with minimal investment. Really, you just need a strong Grievous. So if you don't have a Relic 7 Grievous, it's time to take him to Relic 7. He should have been one of your first Relic 7 characters anyway. That's how good he is. He's not really that strong of a droid leader below Relic 7. I'm going to be considering him for Relic 8, and because of those two pilot ships with the Hyena Bomber and Vulture Droid, that's going to be that much more important. Spy and Soldier, probably going to ignore, but I will consider Sunfax Relic. Spy's Relic is nice for Geos in general, but I don't ever call in that fleet as a reinforcement unless things have gone pretty bad. Unless I want to use it as an Executor counter, that is the only scenario, but really my plan moving forward is to just not use it anymore countering the Executor. I will be doing Executor versus Executor. And before we wrap this up, we need to talk about the Sith. We mentioned them earlier in the video when we were talking about the Empire, but it is very likely that we'll see a additional capital ship. Nihilus with the Ravager was a long time ago rumored. That could have just been delayed, or it could have been fake. We don't really know, but it's something that I think is worth preparing for. And a big part of that is a lot of these pilots are not geared by players, which is a huge incentive for CG to make them viable because it feeds spending. If you didn't go for Sith Eternal Emperor, you're not going to have a Darth Maul or a Sith Marauder. Sith Assassin, almost nobody has, and a lot of people haven't farmed these ships. They thought they could just ignore them. If you haven't finished your farms on these characters or ships, that is something that you should be doing. Prepare for the future where this could happen. There could be more KOTOR content. There is that remake of KOTOR coming out. We could be seeing additional Inquisitors added to the Empire, which might make it even easier for TIE Advance and Emperor Shuttle to move to a dedicated Sith fleet. We could also just see more Sith ships. Dooku could have a ship. So these are the types of things you can be doing to anticipate where the game could be going and to prepare ahead of time to give yourself an edge over an opponent. That's what I've done here. I'm ready to absorb that change if it is to occur. Because right now, once you set those 3 defensive fleets, you only have 4 viable options on offense, which means almost no wiggle room. Adding that other capital ship would insert back into offense enough wiggle room that it would be legitimate. So that is something that I think we need to be anticipating in the near term, and the Sith fleet is the most viable location for that. So that's why I'm not as frustrated as a lot of the player base. I think this is good for the game. I'd rather see these changes too early than too late. I know I'm more prepared than a lot of other players, so it's easy for me to say, but that is why I recommend that free-to-play players especially play the way that I do, because it allows you to absorb these changes by being prepared and by having your roster be more nimble than a lot of the rest of the player base. So be safe out there, everyone, and be excellent to each other. This is Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes.